that we're live, I will read off the sponsors of today's episode. All right. All right. So, everybody, welcome to episode 6 at the Vice. Today's sponsors are HMH. HMH has been making fly tying vices, tying tools, and tube fly material since 1975, located in Biddeford, Maine. Their products are not only made in the U.S., but the vice parts are made in the state of Maine. All HMH products are hand assembled by a small team, not only fly tyers, but registered Maine fly fishing guides. These guys know what works. Any of their products can be seen at tyingvices.com or ask your favorite fly tying shop to get HMH. The second sponsor of our show today, and I want to say thank you, is Midwest Bucktails. If you guys are watching this and there's a special code that Midwest is offering, and it's not just going to be for 24 hours. He's offering it until 11:59 p.m. on Sunday, and the code is ATV10. I will put that in the chat. Today we have a awesome and a special guest that is world famous, literally world famous, and his name is Dan. And I'm going to have Dan do a quick introduction of himself before we go into a whole lot of questions and a lot of answers and comments and all of that. So, Dan, why don't you introduce yourself real quick?
Okay, my name is Dan Blanton. A lot of you are probably familiar with my name. I've been an outdoor writer, writing for various publications for many years since the mid '60s. Fly tying innovator, and I have one of the more popular fly fishing websites. It's been around for 29 years now. So I was one of the first people to get into social media, but I've been around a long time. I've been involved in fly clubs. I helped one of the founders of the San Jose Flycasters, one of the largest fly clubs on the West Coast, and I've just been in the industry for a long time. So uh, I've always been a person that likes to share, likes to learn. I learn a lot from my people that come to my website that post the kind of cool stuff from other tires, and been to a lot of shows, and I've always got an ear open to a new idea, and I've learned a few tricks from other people. So it's kind of a you know wash share the value, share the wealth, the information. So that's how I've been. I've just been in the industry a long time as a outdoor rider, communicator, and fly tire.
Awesome, Dan. Dan, I'm so excited to have you on. When I started fly fishing in the early '90s, literally there was, on one hand you can count, you know, the forefathers of the sport, right? And you were certainly one of those. Um, you know, I'll start off by saying, you mentioned your website. Website is a wealth of knowledge of information on there. So if anybody wants to check it out, danblanton.com.
I have
Um,
it in the description down below, too.
Yeah, yeah, some good stuff. You know, you started off by saying you wrote a lot of publications, but from where I know you from, obviously is the fly fishing in salt waters, which I guess is no longer in publication, but that was a big one too, right, Dan?
Yes, I was a contributing editor. I wrote for that magazine from its inception until its demise. But I started my writing career with a publication, a West Coast California publication called Angler Magazine. And Mike Fong and lots of the top West Coast writers, we wrote for Angler Magazine. And then from there, progressed to saltwater fly fishing, Fishing World. I've written 14 different articles for Fly Fisherman Magazine. So I've written for and for overseas magazines as well. Australian magazines. I was the outdoor editor for Fly Life in Australia. So gotten around. So I've written for quite a few publications over the years. Uh, Currently, I'm not writing much. California fly fisher maybe once in a while, uh, and for one or two other small publications. But I've sort of retired from that. I spend a lot of more of my time on my website and using the internet to share information, which
Sure.
seems to be what people like to do. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, back in my day, in the early '90s, and even in the '80s, like this is what we look forward to: the publications, the magazines, the books. I mean, that was basically the social media of that era. That's how we learned and found all the information out. Basically, now everything's on the internet. Instagram, Facebook. Yeah, the the stuff's like available instantly, basically, if you in YouTube and everything. So it definitely morphed into a huge arena for the social media, and you definitely taken exception. You definitely have gone with that. Like you said, you created this website so long ago, so you were one of the forefathers of that whole era for with fly tying and fly fishing in that respect.
I was lucky. I had a mentor who was a website host, and he encouraged me to develop a website. And he said, Dan, this is going to be really useful for what you do. You write for a lot of magazines, but the internet is going to be where people go in the future for most of their information. I'm not saying magazines aren't still great. I used to, like you, I couldn't wait to get my copy of Fly Fisherman and Fishing World and, all those publications. And I still get them. Yeah, I still get my Australian magazines, but the internet's where people go, and it makes it easier for people like me to disseminate information. So, why not? I got onto it right away.
So Dan, one of the things I want to ask that I haven't asked anybody, obviously, haven't spoken to Lefty. I've spoken to Captain Jake Jordan a few times, but never asked these types of questions. So Dan, how was fly fishing back in the '60s and the '50s and the '70s? Like back then, like the equipment wasn't as good. But even the fishing, at some respect, might have been better. But like growing up and getting into it in that era, how was it back then compared to the way it is now?
Well, in a lot of ways it was better because there were more fish, and we didn't have as many polluted water. I got to get rid of that, whatever this is, virus warning. Oh, there it goes. But, what we had was a couple of clubs, and I didn't have anybody to take me by the hand, so I was interested in fly fishing for trout and stuff, so I joined a club, but at the same time I was really interested in, because I read things from Joe Brooks and a few other people, interested in saltwater fly fishing. I wanted to be a saltwater fly fisherman. So the most obvious choice for me was striped bass, San Francisco Bay, the Sacramento San Joaquin Delta. So I started asking questions, and one of the guys that really helped me out was long gone. He was a very well-known West Coast outdoor writer. He wasn't a fly fishing writer, but his name was Larry Green, and he wrote for a couple of major magazines. He did a column, and Larry knew that the area around the San Francisco airport, that was where the flats were on the west side of the bay where I was. And he told me way back when, in the early 60s, Dan, go down around the airport, San Francisco airport, around the runways on those flats. Go there. So I used to go there, and I remember going at night and fishing off the bank because I didn't have a boat at that time. Right. And I'm telling you, did I catch a striped bass. Then I finally got a skiff, and it was a 14-foot Starcraft Mariner with a 10-horsepower Mercury motor outboard, and I'd go around those flats, and I'd get up on a flat, and I'd taken Lefty Cray out one time, in I think it was 1970, 71, 72, something like that, and we were drifting the flats, and I didn't have an electric motor. I couldn't afford one. So we're going along the flats, and the wind's pushing me a little hard, and I'm using the tiller on my outboard to kind of steer me. And Lefty says, Dan, you got a hardware store around here? I said, yeah, there's one. Let's go back to the marina. Went back to the marina, got in the car. I left my boat tied up at the dock, went up to the hardware store, and he bought a 6-foot length of heavy link chain and 100 feet of rope, and he made me a drag chain. We went back out on those same flats, And by just adjusting from, starboard to port transom, I could adjust a little bit of the direction that the boat was going to go and adjust the tack and all that. And it slowed my drift down by just not more or less, and it was perfect. And from that day on, I was never without a drag chain. Even today, I got a drag chain in my skiff, even though I got electric motors and all the works, because it works. And Lefty turned me on to that. So, you learn things from everybody. And Lefty was one of the wonderful guys that he was my mentor. He helped me with my writing. He helped me just so much. And, I didn't get to know him until later, but I was doing a lot of it on my own, ferreting out where I could go to fly fish. For example, I caught my first striped bass on a fly when I was 15 years old, fly fishing the hot water outflow from the PG&E power plant, the cooling water, the hot water that ran into the Sacramento River right below the Antioch Bridge. And I knew my dad fished there. I knew striped bass would come into that outflow and feed on the bait that was getting chopped up and coming through the turbines and all that. And I only had about 15 feet of room for a back cast because there was a cyclone fence and I was on a rock levee. So I made a lead core shooting head that was 10 feet long with about a 3-foot, 20-pound test leader, and I was using about 30-pound monofilament shooting line. That back in the day, we used monofilament for shooting line. And I could, boom, quick back cast, boom, I could pop that fly out there about 40 feet. And in that lead core line would get me down. And man, I hooked my first striped bass. I was 15 years old. couldn't have been happier. And
what fly did you catch that bass on?
I caught that fly on a Joe Brooks
Blondie?
Blonde, a red top, white bottom. A Joe Brooks. In fact, I had that fly around here somewhere. I was going to show you, but Joe Brooks Blonde. But it was a red and white one. And then a little later, about 1964 or so, I came up with the Whistler, and I wanted a fly that would compete with a bucktail leadhead jig. I needed a fly that would dip and dive like a bucktail jig does when it falls. I wanted it to push water because our water wasn't clear. Like I said, our water in the bay was a little off color. It was a little turbid. And so I designed this Whistler pattern. And the first one was all white with a red stripe, white collar, big heavy white collar, 3 hackles, like a 3 hackles, white bucktail with a deep profile, red stripe, red chenille. Then later, I don't have that fly with me, but later I came up with this color, the red and white with a grizzly side. And this is a small one because I tie these things big. And that was my second version. And then it went on from there to my favorite color for the same fly. But for my Delta colors, I like this white, yellow, green kind of a combination. This has been used. It's a little beat up. And then from there, bigger, darker water, I went to this big guy.
Hold it vertical if you can, Dan. Hold it vertical.
That's it.
Vertical. I mean, the opposite direction. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, this way. Yeah, yep. This way. And it's just a Whistler, same as I tie them all, but just bigger. Bead eyes. And the Whistler got its name because when I first tied it with bead eyes, California, I was a salmon fisherman. We used gold comets and comet style flies. They all had bead eyes. So my flies, it made sense to me, put bead eyes on them. And then when the first time I cast them, this fly would go zinging by my ear. The orifices in the beads would whistle.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that. Yeah,
that's how I named it the Whistler. Yeah. And so I tie it in lots of different colors. This is a dark pattern for dark water, brown. Sometimes bright. Really sticking out there like a yellow one. But they're all tied basically the same. Big heavy collar in the front to push water, undulate, and then a broad profile. And I started tying flash tails, 10 years, 12, 14 years ago. The original ones did not have a flash tail. They were just the wing. But the flash tail, I had to thinking about it. I says, look, spinner blades, spoons, they all have flash. Why not add, when Flashaboo came about, and it moved well, versus heavy stiff mylar, I started tying my flies with flash tails, and what I do is when I have the hook in the vise, what I do is I tie the eyes on first, then I tie 15 to 20 strands. I use a mix of Flashaboo and silver flash and crinkly flash, and I tie it on the bend of the hook. And then I don't know if you can notice, you see how that tail drops right there? But I put flex cement out about an inch or so. That keeps the tail from fouling around. Oh, see, it's an anti-foul thing. I don't have to put a piece of mono or anything. Just do that, because that's going to still get covered over once you tie that on, the eyes on, this on. Then you just build the fly, and then you cut the flash tail. I usually do it a couple inches past the end of the tail of the fly, and if it's too long, I'll cut a little shorter with my scissors. If the fish seem to be spooking from flash, I can cut it all out.
Okay.
But if you don't have it, it's hard to put it in.
Yeah.
So, but I have learned since fishing all over the world that those flash tails, especially if the water's got a little color to it, you go to jungle rivers and San Francisco, places like that, the flash tail, even in clear water, and it can really turn them on. They just boom, And a lot of times you see schools of bait that are milling like this, and they're flashing all over the place.
Flashing.
They thrash, and then what I do too is I tie some rattle flies, and I buy these tubes with the rattle in it, but I don't. But what I do is I tie it off the bend of the hook, like that.
Yeah.
And then I lash that rattle tube off the bend of the hook and build my wing around it.
Okay.
It really works good. Now, the hooks I prefer for all my flies, if I could get away with it, and I started using these 60-degree bend jig hooks. 60-degree bend jig hooks. Started using them 10, 15 years ago, maybe more.
Is that the Umpqua one?
This is the Targus or the Umpqua U506, or the UH506, or the Targus. Excuse me, just a second. The Targus AR413. Those hooks I like a lot. But the Umpqua hook on if you're going to use it in smaller sizes, like you're going to tie a small whistler or small fly with a jig hook, I would use the heavy, they call it H506. Yeah, because with that H506 you can land 100-pound tarpon, So, but I tie, God, I catch everything that I can on a 60-degree bend jig hook for a couple of reasons. First of all, the hook rides hook up, and then the 60-degree bend itself, the 60-degree bend, it acts like a lever. So when you stick, that hook will stick better. It usually sticks in the top of the mouth of the corner. Rarely, even if they swallow it, boom, it rarely ever sticks them in the gills. It's always in the top.
Okay.
I can't count. I can count on 2 fingers how many times since I started using this hook that I've actually hooked one in the gills. But it rides hook up, and this 60-degree bend acts like a lever. So when the point sticks, this wants to pull it in even more. It acts like a pry bar, if you can imagine that. And I use a loop knot, so the more you pull, the more it wants to reef it in. I started dropping far fewer fish when I switched over to a 60-degree bend jig hook. Now, I don't use a 90-degree bend because that's for vertical jigging.
Right.
60-degree bends are made for retrieving. So,
okay.
And there's some flies I still use a J hook, which is the standard hook, J hook. But if I can get away with it, I use a 60-degree bend jig hook. Except, there's flies like, for example, my punch fly. This is one of my favorite tropical tarpon flies. and tropical snook fly and tarpon fly, and about that size on like a 2/0 hook. And I'll still use that one. I could tie it on a J hook, but I still use it on a J hook. Maybe out of habit, I don't know. But everything else, I tie on a jig hook if I can. I just think it's a better hooking, better riding, all the way around, better performing hook for most situations, noted exception.
Now, when you have a smaller fish and you got that hook riding up, you don't ever see it going through the brain or through an eyeball or anything like that?
I would tell you honestly, occasionally I've had that happen. Not the brain so much, but up around the eye area. Most of the time, if it goes in the top of the mouth, it's more forward. It's not going to go up into the brain.
Okay.
But I've had far more fish hurt by using a J hook that have hooked in the gills. And you reef on them. Saltwater fishing, you don't muss around. You don't lift the rod like you're trout fishing.
Yeah.
And if you hook them in a gill raker, I've brought fish in where I've ripped 1 or 2 gill rakers right off the gill, right just out, with a J hook.
Okay.
So I've hurt far more fish in my career early on when I was using J hooks than I ever have using a jig hook. And I lose far fewer flies because even though the J hook is not totally snag free, it will, by virtue of, especially with a whistler, it will, by just hook riding up, it will ride over a lot of obstructions.
Yep.
Now, it can't get through everything, let's face it, but it is far more snag free than a J hook, just the nature of the hook. So there's a lot of pluses there. But to use that hook over a J hook and you can convert any fly to that style of hook. Yeah, if you can put bead eyes, you can put eyeballs. I use the Spirit River eyeballs on these. You can extra weight. Like I said, I put if I'm going to do a rattle, I do it off the end on a piece of mono, build around it. If I don't want to rattle, I just tie the fly's tail on with the eyes first, and then build around it and cut the fly's tail the length I want. My favorite all-around fly that I use in the Delta a lot versus the Whistler is what I call the jig hook fly's tail minnow. It's tied clouser style. In fact, I used to call it the jig hook fly's tail clouser, but Umpqua asked me not to call it that. They should call it Blanton's jig hook fly's tail minnow because it really wasn't like a little skinny clouser, but it's tied clouser style. And it's like saying, okay, every fly that's tied deceiver style is a deceiver, or every fly tied whistler style is a whistler. It's not, in its variations. But I would tell you that I use Bob Clouser's style to tie the fly. It's made it bigger, fuller. And I use, I tell you, see how deep body bait fishes, San Francisco Bay stripers fed on a variety of bait fish, and one of their favorites when you fished around structure was pile perch.
Really?
And little pile perch. And sometimes big pile perch. Of course, they had a deep body. They weren't skinny. They weren't skinny like an anchovy. I have a fly called the Sarmalmac, which stands for sardine, mullet, mackerel, that I tied back in the 70s. And I used to tie it with glass taxidermy eyes. They came on a piece of wire. They were for mounting ducks.
Yeah.
And I'd bend and put it. But now I just build the chenille head, and I build the chenille head, make a nice, and I glue the 3D plastic eyes on. You come with a post, cut the post off, and you use goop. You can glue anything on with goop. It ain't coming off. It ain't coming off. So I just glue them on with goop. I put a tube of goop, put the eyes on, let them dry good. They're good for 100 fish as long as the fly lasts. So that's my anchovy style, or deep. You can make a green mackerel out of it by tying it that color or whatever. That's called Sarmalmac, sardine, mullet, mackerel. So it's a simulator fly, depending on your color, So that one I still tie on a J hook. You notice that? Still on a J hook.
Yep.
And I could probably tie it on a jig hook. I just haven't done it yet. So those styles, but the deep body flies like this, one of the materials I find that I like a lot, and I use it a lot, I used to use nothing but bucktail. That was all my flies were out of bucktail. And pardon me, guys, just a second. My nose. But now, for most of the wing, I use what is called flash and slinky.
Yeah.
Yes.
This stuff,
Yeah. By H2O. Right?
yeah, it is great.
Yeah.
It's wavy. It's got built-in flash, and you can build a nice full body out of it, and it comes in every color of the rainbow. And I use that, and I sometimes will put a little strip, a little bit of bucktail, natural bucktail, like in this fly, right over the very top after I've used the flash and slinky. A little bit of bucktail over the top, some crystal flash, for a topping. But most of the wing is synthetic. It's flash and slinky. It's really good stuff, and it holds up really well. And when it gets all knotty and gnarly, all you have to do is take a comb. Just take a comb and comb it out and go back to business. And then you can also shape, with a pair of scissors, you can shape the belly if you really want to get a nice curved, perch type belly, whatever. So anyway, I'm rambling on here, so,
Well,
Good stuff.
but yeah, if you got questions or you want to ask questions, I'll stop talking now.
Yeah, I have a well, not really a question, but if we can spend a few minutes talk about the striped bass conservation in your area, along with a couple questions with that. Do the striped bass in the San Francisco Bay actually migrate? Do they go out to the ocean and?
Yes, they go out to the ocean. During the spring, or spawning season, a lot of times they'll migrate up the Sacramento San Joaquin River. It's a huge system of rivers. Sacramento San Joaquin system up into the California Delta, which is 1,000 miles of navigable waterways in that labyrinth of delta waters. And that's coming down. Most of it, that they spawn in the fresh water. They'll move up the Sacramento River, the main rivers of Sacramento, the Feather. They'll spawn in fresh moving water. They have to have that.
Right.
And so they'll make that move to spawn in the spring. And a lot of them will go up in the fall early. Some of them stay up there and don't come down. I mean, they catch huge stripers up there. But most of them go up, spawn, and then they come back down to the bay system. And they'll spend back out. They'll go out in the ocean. Kind of, I guess, the salt water revitalizes them or does something for them. It perks them up. And then they'll come back into San Francisco Bay, South San Francisco Bay, the North Bay, and up into the lower estuary. And they'll spend the summer in that system. And then, again, in the fall, they'll migrate back upriver. So they do not all of them, not every school or every group of fish, family of fish, does exactly the same thing at the same time. In fact, when the California Department of Fish and Game, they brought the stripers out from the East Coast. They're not native to California.
right.
Yeah. What they did, though, they were smart. The biologists brought two different groups of fish that spawned at slightly different times. One an early spawner, one a little bit late spawner. So that they would kind of guarantee they would have a successful spawn of some kind. So we've got stripers up there in the river system early, and then we've got some that are later. And there's a whole fishery established to fish in the river. They fish with bait. They fish with lures, trolling. Guys cast flies. I've caught fish on flies in the river system, in the bay system as well. So the fisheries people did a pretty good job establishing striped bass in the San Francisco, Sacramento, San Joaquin River system.
Dan, are they catch and release only?
No, they have a minimum size. I believe it is 18 inches. I think
Wow.
I got to tell you, I haven't been keeping up with it. But the last I heard, the minimum size was 18 inches. I would like to have seen it go to 22 or 23. But they chose 18 inches because the biologist said, well, that's the earliest they could spawn. At least they would get one spawning in. But I'd like to see it. I'd like to see that size go up. I'd like to see it go 26 inches, but it'd be tough to get that one through.
It's pretty amazing if you really think about it. For them to bring the stripers to the West Coast and for them to go out to the ocean and come back and spawn, and to redo that cycle, I mean, they've tried to do it with, Atlantic salmon on the East Coast here, and even after taking out dams, the Atlantic salmon are not surviving. For a non-native fish to be able to do that, that's absolutely phenomenal. Phenomenal.
Well, I think the reason is striped bass is very adaptable. For example, we have striped bass in freshwater impoundments like San Luis Reservoir and O'Neill Forebay. I caught my personal best size striper last year out of San Luis Reservoir. This is freshwater lake, fishing my flies, 40 pounds. And I've caught my biggest fish. I've caught 7 fish over 30 pounds out of San Luis Reservoir and its equalizing basin, a smaller lake right below it where the water comes and goes. I've caught 7 fish over 30 pounds there. They come out of the canal system that hooks to the delta. So the eggs and small fry from spawning striped bass that are flowing downriver, you know how eggs have got to float for 76 hours or something like that they get sucked into that canal system that's sending water to Southern California into the Central Valley for agriculture. And they get into this big reservoirs, massive reservoirs, 65 miles of shoreline and over 200 feet deep at its deepest point when full of American shad, threadfin shad, lots of food for striped bass, and they get big. Largest one caught on a fly is 54.5 pounds.
Wow.
Oh,
now, Dan, have you noticed in the fresh water they it seems like in the salt water they're a little more spunky. They have a little more metabolism. There's a little higher rated. Have you found that?
I would say the salt water. If you catch them fresh out of the ocean, or even I used to even go out in the bay, go out of the river into the ocean, fish the adjacent either side of the mouth of the rivers down the beaches from a boat. And guys fish from the beach with plugging gear and surf gear. And I noticed that those fish, and also the ones that came in from the ocean, were a little hotter. They were a little hotter, a little spunkier, but they were also slimmer, and they were in like prime condition. The ocean revitalizes after spawning. They go out in the ocean. That salt water does something to them, and they get plenty of food. And you catch the fish in the lake. They've been in the lakes a while and they get big. They get like Miss Piggy. They get huge pot bellies. And they pull, but they don't pull like those saltwater, slender, streamlined, the Corvettes. They don't pull like the Corvettes. They pull more like a tank. Don't get me wrong. They're fun to catch, and they will pull. They will take string. And but I would say if you're going to fly fishermen in the area, San Francisco Bay Area, and even Point South, if you were really looking for a trophy striped bass, you'd fish San Luis Reservoir or the O'Neill Forebay. And Al Whitehurst and those guys, if they've proved it, I've done it, getting big fish out of those reservoirs because they don't have to work against big currents and things, don't burn up their calories, and they get plenty of food. So instead of getting, but they can get big, they just get,
So now, on the East Coast, we deal with a lot of moons when we fish for stripers. It's all about the moon phase, the tide, and all of that. Now, when you're fishing on the West Coast with the San Francisco Bay, are you looking for moons and tides as well? And then how does that affect it as far as when they're up in the freshwater? A lot of guys do fish in the Delaware system, the upper Delaware for striped bass, but they're doing a lot of stuff with bait or just plugs. They're really trying to catch walleye, and they're smashing stripers in the system. So I was just curious, how does that affect fishing? Because I have never fished for stripers in freshwater.
Well, in freshwater, in a river system, yes, tides do play a role as long as you're still within the tidal zone, and that tidal zone can be quite a ways upriver. For example, you could have incoming water 30, 40 miles upriver. San Francisco Bay is at San Francisco, Oakland. And then you got Sacramento, 50 miles upriver, and you still can have incoming and outgoing tides. Certain places, just like in, certain points, certain coves, certain places in the bay and on your coast will produce better on outgoing tides, some are incoming. I've always liked, personally, San Francisco Bay, I like high falling. And so if we had, I like what we called in the bay system, because we fish flats there. The water anywhere from high tide, it would be 4 feet deep, and could be as shallow as 1.5 feet. But I like to fish on the neap tides, NEAP. That was tides that occurred on the quarter moon phases, and that meant you didn't get a real high, and you didn't get a real low. You got a moderate each direction. So when I got up in the morning, I always tried to be on the flats. Legally, you couldn't fish from a boat in San Francisco Bay except 1 hour before sunrise. You couldn't go out at night legally in a boat. You could fish off the bank, but not at night. And the way it was explained to me, look, San Francisco Bay is a dangerous place, lots of flats, lots of things. We don't want people running around out there at night. Well, I used to go out there at night anyway because I knew places to fish where they'd be. So I used to try to always go on a neap tide on the quarter moon phase, because in the morning I would have high water just starting to fall. So I could go up on those flats and there'd be water there and there'd be fish there. You could see them even in 1.5 feet, 2 feet, like an hour before sunrise. That's when you could legally start. You could see those wakes. They'd be up there in that shallow water. I'd throw on a big black whistler or a big Given Barton black, and that's when we fished at night, black flies, and we'd catch them. But if you went out on a full moon or new moon, you'd have a minus low tide in the morning. There would be no water on the flats, so you're wasting your time. And then the best fishing, and then if the tide come in, you might get them, but they would feed at night on that falling tide, and by the time you got there, no water, they're done feeding. So, I always time my fishing around the quarter moon phases because I'd have the right tides for those flats. Now, I'm not saying you couldn't go to other places on the big spring tides, but where I fished on South San Francisco Bay, the airport area, on those flats, the quarter moon phases were the best tides to be on. Didn't matter which phase, as long as the quarter moon.
That makes a whole lot of sense.
And I follow a similar thing because I fish a lot of flats here in Jersey. I don't have a boat, so I have to access a lot of my water on foot. And I like wading the flats because nobody fishes the flats because they're too afraid to go there with the boat and to beach the boat and destroy a motor, lose a motor. So I get the flats to myself because there's nobody else that's willing to go out there. Usually I try to do a buddy system because sometimes you'll get big boys come in there and they bump you like a little shark, a little bull shark here and there. And, sometimes you start running a little pee down your pants and you're like, man, what was that? I don't know what that was. So
we gotta get my garage queen out of the garage so we can go fishing.
Well, I tell you what, on our flats, our flats would be loaded with leopard sharks, and I think they were not bull sharks. They were a gray shark or something. The blue sharks are more pelagic. We wouldn't see them on the flats, but leopard sharks, and they came in. They didn't bother us, but I was more worried about big stingrays. Yeah. We had the big manta rays, and they'd get right up on those flats, and you could step on one, and boy, that tail come up, you could get tagged.
Yeah, that's how Steve Irwin died.
Yeah, well, I remember that. Yeah. But I used to walk, and our bay bottom was muddy. It was sticky mud. So you had very few areas where there was sandy bottoms. Most of it was that muck stuff, and I waded. A lot of guys did. Yeah, and I would selectively fish off certain points where I could be on dry land but still reach a rip or some water. But I couldn't wait to get a boat. I got my boat, my little 14-foot Seafarer. But there was times I was out there coming back in when the wind kicked up on those flats from no wind to gusting to 30 miles an hour, and I had waves 4 feet, 5 feet high breaking, and you could see the mud. They'd break and stir the bottom up and have to come back in. Fortunately, I always ran the way I could go, so if I had to come back, I could be quartering into the wind instead of following seas were far more dangerous than quartering into the waves. So, but then I got my bigger Starcraft, and then now I've got my. It's not a fancy boat, but I got my Western Eagle fiberglass 18-footer, the big flare hull, and 115 horse, and it handles that stuff really good. I bought the boat for that reason, for chop, for getting in. You can take both waves and chop. So, anyway.
I've had 4 or 5 boats, Dan. I have one now. I don't ever use them. They just sit there, and I don't know what the issue is, but this one I got now is awesome, and I'm rigging it up, So me and George are gonna get out on it soon. But I love boats too, and this is a great segue to something I want to talk about. I had a fascination with blue water fishing, right? So I got into it big time, but I guess my fallback was I also got seasick. So so I had many problems with that, and I've had a lot of head injuries from mountain biking and hockey and whatnot, and now it's even worse. So I can't even, it's hard for me to even get out. But anyway, so a great segue into what I want to talk about is that I've known that basically you and a few other guys pioneered that whole offshore mothership thing, right? Off of what was it out of San Diego?
Right. Yeah. Long Beach, and San Diego. Yes. We did them both. We'd go out of San Diego a lot, but we'd also fish long range out of Long Beach too, fishing just offshore. Because sometimes the bluefin tuna and yellowfin would come in. We didn't always have to go down into Mexico. We could always fish sometimes San Diego, from L.A. And so but if we went, the long range basically went down into Mexico. Right. And we could, and we were on a big ship, 65-footer, a big ship, and we'd fill up the bait tanks with live bait, and so when we got down to where the fish were, we'd dip a big scoop and dump the live bait over the transom as chum, and those fish would come up and be boiling. We'd see them porpoising around the back of the boat. And basically all you had to do was slap a big Sarmalmac or Deceiver style, Sarmalmac style, anything that was long and looked a little bit like an anchovy or a mackerel, and you got bit. You got bit. And then you hooked into 30-pound, 40-pound Pacific yellowtail. Sometimes you get an amberjack, but mostly the yellowtail. You're going to see backing you never saw before. Then if you got in... Yeah, if you got into, we once in a while got into what the junior size bluefin tuna.
Footballs,
They
right?
would be, they'd be bigger than footballs. They would be more like oil barrels. They'd be 30, 40 pounds. So maybe some smaller, but when you got into those 30, 40-pound class fish, woo! And the biggest problem people had wasn't the big long run and cranking all that string back, because most of them didn't apply the drag tight enough.
It's the vertical fight,
yeah, you guys aren't putting enough drag on these. I tighten that drag up, point the rod at them, and I remember Wendy Hanvold. Here's a woman that was one of the best blue water fishermen I ever saw, Wendy Hanvold. But she knew how to fight them. She didn't try to pull the fish back. She would point the rod right at them, clamp the spool of it, direct drive reel, big one, big Able or somebody, a T-bore, well, you name it. T-bores and Ables were the popular ones back then. Clamp the spool, and she would take 3 or 4 steps back from the rail, literally hand-lining the fish, literally pulling the fish with a straight rod, back up, walk forward, crank up the slack, lock her elbows to her side, take 3 or 4 steps back, same deal. That's how she fought him.
Using your body weight, yeah.
Using body weight and her legs. Now, I was always the one, I wrote about it. I taught it. How to beat your fish quicker by playing the angles, pulling them off balance, always never pulling straight up. You're always pulling left or right. You're constantly changing the angle, constantly changing. Even when they're down, straight down, by constantly bringing your rod back and forth and cranking, as you swish the rod and you change angles, you're lifting at the same time. That slight change of angle throws the fish slightly off balance, and it slips in the water column. And I remember on the long range trip, I was doing that. And we had a group of guys from Japan, very good fishermen. They wanted to come. They read about the long range trips. So they joined myself, Steve Abel, and a bunch of guys on this long range trip. And we'd take turns. We'd have 5 anglers, 3 across the transom, 1 on each quarter. And they'd throw the bait, and we'd hook up. And when you hooked up, you'd step out, and another guy would step in. So when I was up there fighting this fish, I was beating my fish, and please, folks, forgive me. I'm not bragging. I'm just saying this was how it happened, because everybody would just pull like this, and I would play those angles, beating those fish 2 or 3 times faster, even when they were vertical, than anybody else. And those guys from Japan would be sitting up there on the upper deck looking down, because it wasn't their turn yet. And when they would see, they were watching me. And then later I'd go up there, and they'd be there fishing, and they would be doing what I was doing. And they would be talking to each other in Japanese, and their heads would be going up and down. Yeah, it works. Look at this. Look at this. It works, yeah. And the guy that was there, the only one he was the editor for the Japanese magazine. I forget the name of it, but it was a fly fishing magazine. Wonderful magazine. He asked me, "Dad, will you write an article on fish fighting techniques for my magazine?" And I did. And they had it illustrated with great line drawings. It was kind of almost like cartoons, but it showed me getting the angles and doing this and doing that, tripping them and all that stuff in that Japanese magazine. So they were observant. They were paying attention. And then they went down and tried it themselves. They go, "Hey, Blanton this works. This works." And they took it back with them. So I did a lot of stories about how to fight fish properly. And the same techniques applies for fishing steelhead and salmon.
Yeah.
You play them off balance. You keep them off balance. You just don't pull back. That doesn't, you got to have, by playing them off balance, and they just can't hold up to that. It just works.
Works. I've had a few conversations with Captain Jake Jordan, who you probably know, right? I mean,
of course,
yeah. So we've had many conversations. So when I had my boat and went after tuna, we would employ when there was a hookup, we would have a guy move the boat out of position to fight, not to fight that vertical game like you said, to create that angle.
Yeah. And
you can whoop a fish pretty fast. So I mean, Jake's told me he's whooped 200-pound bluefin in 15 minutes. With the same techniques you're talking about, just fighting it, pointing a rod at the fish and using your drag. And sometimes after he runs once or twice, you lock the drag and you just pull him in. You know.
Yeah. And I've seen Jake do that, and I've done it. We've done it on the long range. Once, like for example, I was doing it, and Steve Abel would pick up on it, and a few more of the more experienced guys would start picking up on that technique. The guys were beating fish just incredibly fast. And then of course Jake, he's one of the top, Jake's one of the best there is. And he's been doing that on the tarpon game and on blue water for years. And Jake and myself, Lefty Cray, Stu App was a hero of mine. I was one of Lefty's mentors and one of Stu App's mentors. Stu App, he had some of the earliest really good fish fighting techniques. Stu was the guy that taught me how to play the angles, how to pull them off balance. It was Stu, and he was the one that would use his forearms and his wrists and play those fish off balance. But I noticed when Stu got older, and he and I fished together when he was in his 80s, and I was in my 50s, fishing down in Panama and Costa Rica on blue water trips, and Stu could no longer use his arms like that. that's when he would point the rod straight at him, do like Wendy Hampton, point the rod straight at him, clamp down on that palming rim, and back up. Pull the fish. He'd straight line him. Back, crank forward, walk forward, back, and he'd still beat him. He'd still beat him fast. Here's this guy in his 80s, and he's still doing it. But he was doing it that way. He had to change his fighting techniques, but he adapted. And women, he taught women to fight fish that way, because they obviously don't have, not all of them, some do, but not all of them have the arm strength and shoulder strength that a guy does. So it works.
Dan, real quick, did you ever get into? I know I've spoken to Captain Conway Bowman a few times. Did you ever get into that mako fly fishing at all?
I've caught a few makos on fly. We don't have a lot on the Pacific coast. They're there. We've gone out of San Diego and went out and did the chum slick, and I think I've caught one or two, not very big, 50 pounds, 60 pounds, not like Conway. They've got, in Australia, of course, they've got lots of them. But now, I fished out of Australia several times. I've been to Australia 7 times. But I've usually gone there after, not, I fished blue water a lot, but I've gone there for other things. But yeah, Conway, he was a guy that kind of took that on. It was his gig, and he did a hell of a job.
Yeah.
He's a great blue water fisherman, and he made that mako fishing with a fly rod, put it on the map, kind of like.
Yeah, I'm thinking about doing a trip, for a couple of days. That's, something I wanted to achieve.
You want to get a mako?
Yes.
Is that what it is? Yeah. Well, whatever you do, don't go undergunned. Don't try for a light. Take a 13, 14 weight rod.
I got a 17 weight. Hey, hey, Dan. Back with your long range trips, do you remember a kid that used to come with you guys? His name was Captain Billy Hayes.
Oh yeah.
So he used to run a fly shop in here in Pennsylvania, and I've known him a long time. Obviously, I don't know if you know, but he passed away a little while ago.
No, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
But he's on a couple of the trips with us.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
So I went tuna fishing with him a couple times off in Martha's Vineyard. So
Yeah.
He told me a story. He told me a story that there was that Gary Loomis made 3. I think it was him or maybe it was Jake Jordan. 3 G Loomis 20 weight fly rods, and that Billy had one because I used it, and then Jake said he had one, and they don't know where the third one is.
Well, I don't have it. I tell you that. I don't know where it went, but I don't have it. But I wouldn't doubt that, because it's interesting, and I don't remember all the names, and it's just old age, I guess. But we had a number of guys that came from the East Coast that had read about the long range and what we were doing, and they wanted to get in on it. And they came from the Eastern Joint Dart groups. And I was using the biggest Fenwicks I could get at the time. Then I got a few custom-made rods that were 13 weight, 14 weight, and I don't think I ever blew up a rod. But see, I knew what you did. I didn't know how not to hoop them to blow them up. The guys that would high stick the rods and they'd get that, I'd tell them, don't do that, don't do that. Keep that rod. You only put your hand up. In fact, that's why I always liked the rod built with what we called an assist grip or a fighting grip that was only started about 2 inches above the casting grip.
Right.
It let you put that other hand right where it was supposed to be versus all the way up to the first stripping guide and blow the rod up.
Yep.
So, but you needed to help lift sometimes, and I never blew a rod up, but I did have Winston and a few other custom-made rods that they were purposely built for that kind of thing. They were thicker walled and heavier guides, big stripping guides, and the snake guides were all heavy duty, bigger to clear, oversized stripping guides, so that when you hooked up and that fish took off, and your running lines, you're trying not to have it jump off and coil up in a big wad. You're letting it strip through your big
fingers,
form of donut, trying to keep it. But you wanted the biggest guides you could get, because every once in a while you still had it snarl up, and you had to get bird's nest through the guides, and it happened more than once.
I'm gonna go a little off the topic here.
Go
And
for it.
I'm gonna change it up a little bit. I want to know a little bit about your wife because she's pretty well known in the fly fishing industry as well. And a lot of people might not know about it, but she's a great instructor and she's an author, right, and a photographer. Can you tell us a little bit about
Wait
Sydney?
a minute, wait a minute. You might be confusing somebody else. My wife's
Nah.
Yeah, no, my wife Cindy. She's a great artist. She's a wonderful artist. She's a good photographer. She doesn't specialize in photography. She fishes with me once in a while, but she's not a regular fisherman. Uh, you might be confusing Terry Gunn's wife, Wendy Gunn, who's a yeah,
Mm,
but Cindy Blanton doesn't fish a lot. She's been with me on trips. She's good at what she does when she goes, but her thing is, I'm sorry, her thing is art and sculpting and taking
well,
pictures.
well, to be honest with you, it's in your bio
Is
that
it?
she
It's
was a
in,
yeah.
maybe it wasn't my first wife either. So maybe you're talking about somebody else's wife. I don't know about my bio. I didn't write that bio. I got my bio on my website right.
Yeah, that's where I read it from. That's why I brought it up.
That my wife was that she's a good fisherman, but she's not avid. Okay, it doesn't matter.
Okay.
That's
Yeah.
Yeah, doesn't matter. But let me say this about her. It takes a special wife to have a hardcore world traveled. I don't want to say world class, just world traveled uh, angler that's gone on trips. I used to do 4, 5, 6 exotic trips a year. I'm down to luckily one or two, uh, and let me fish. I mean, let me literally encourage me, and not that she's got a boyfriend on the side wants to get rid of me, but she knows it's healthy. It knows it keeps me occupied, keeps me healthy. I'll be 80 in June. I'm in good shape. 'Cause I did play competitive racquetball till I was 55. But anyway, so she's a wonderful wife in that regard. She's very supportive. She helps. If she could tie as good a fly as anybody, because she's creative, she's artistic. But no, she would love to go on trips with me. She's been with me to Brazil. She's been with me to lots of places, Mexico, uh, Florida Keys, you name it. She's been with me to a lot of places, and maybe fish with me a few days, and then go touring. But
Yeah.
she's not hard. She's not hardcore, no, by any chance.
Yeah, if you're a hardcore fly fisherman and you're married, you need that. I mean, I have that too. I mean, it's
Yeah.
my wife just told me yesterday, like I had a charter booked today, and and,
Uh,
and it was funny because I have a boat that sits in the garage that I've used 4 times in 2 years, and
uh,
she's like, you got to start using your boat, and not hire captains anymore.
well, my wife, she doesn't say it like that, but here's how, because my skiff, and it's not an expensive boat. It's a nice boat. It's a Western Eagle. It's a single hull. It's got the right flare. Got 115 Yami on it. It's a great boat for what I do. But it's been sitting on the trailer for over a year. I haven't used it, not because I don't want to, but my buddy's been taking his boat. So he drives up to my place. I get in his car, put my gear in, and go in his boat. I don't have to come home and clean it. But she's going, you might want to go out there and use that boat, get it going, and she's not saying it like, don't, you've spent all that money on that boat, now go use it. That she knows, that's the situation. But
Yeah.
but I've got to start using it too. You can't let a boat sit and haven't run my outboard for a year. I did go out and start it, but that's
Yeah,
not good for it either.
I certainly do that too. Yeah.
So what's like what would you say for some of the new, like a new guy that's coming in that's newly married that fishes a lot? What do you think is what would be the one advice you could give them as to keeping a healthy relationship with their loved one, and keeping a good respected fishing relationship as well?
You have to do things for together, but especially for your wife. If your wife wants to go to an art show, and you go. and you don't go around with a pout on your face and a hang down. You go. You take her. You take her to places. She don't expect you to do it tit for tat, equal amount. Once in a while, and you do it willingly without begrudgment. And if you do that, you're not going to get any static. If your wife really, she understands what you are, what you've done. Now, I would say this to anybody, any young guy just getting married, has been dating, going to get married, and he's an avid, hardcore, he just dies to fish. He'd better make sure his wife, or potential his future wife, understands that's what he does. He likes it. And then, but you've got to compensate. You've got to give the wife, you got to give in a little bit. You got to do it willingly, not begrudgingly. If you do that, I don't think any reasonable woman's going to begrudge you going fishing, especially if that's part of your business. I guided too. I was a guide for 20 years. So not only did I guide people fishing on the San Francisco Bay and the Delta, but I worked in my fishing as well. So I fished a lot. Especially when I retired, I worked full time for Pacific Gas and Electric Company, but I retired early when I was 55. I used to fish every weekend. So I had to give one of those weekends to the wife. Then when I retired at 55 and went full time into guiding, then again, here I was gone. And then I'd be up the Delta with my RV for two or 3 months at a time. And Cindy would come up, and then we'd go do something. And,
I'm on the brink of that, Dan, and I can't wait.
Yeah. You can't. You're ready to.
I'm ready I'm ready to go fishing like 4 or 5 times a week. I do that now, but mainly at night, and it's boring by yourself. And
yeah,
I like fishing
whenever
with
you
people.
want to go. Let's go.
I like fishing with people, Dan. I mean, I've done the solo thing and going out in the middle of the night in the dark, and you catch some fish, but it's sharing that with somebody else is even better.
Well, I agree with you, and I always had somebody in my boat. Now, I used to go alone a lot. I used to go alone, especially at night when I couldn't get somebody because everybody else had family or they had work. So I'd go alone. I was hardcore.
Yeah.
But today, I don't think it's smart. I don't think you should be going anywhere in a boat alone. And, having a partner is more fun. You're talking it up. You're building memories together. And you've got a partner that helps you if you get in trouble. At least he's there. I don't like a crowded boat. Even in my 18-footer, I don't like 3 people. 2 people's enough.
2 people, yeah.
Yeah. I think I've taken 3 people, and they're good casters. Now I can cast through the boat in the center console, and if I cast 8 hours, I might hit the center console once. I can throw through the boat. I've done it all my life with heavy lines. I'm talking big flies, whistlers, and heavy flies, and heavy sinking lines. Most of the fishing we do, we're fishing type 3, but mostly T14 or T11 sinking lines, or a full floater with surface stuff. But it's getting down, even in 5-6 feet of water, if there's current, or even not current, we want to hit the water with the fly, boom, count the minimum and start pulling for stripers. You don't need to dawdle the fly for stripers. Stopping and dropping is good in deep water. If you're fishing like a reservoir, and you're like San Luis Reservoir, I'm fishing out at the pump racks. The water's 250 feet deep there. But the fish might be holding, I see them on the graph, 30 feet. And so I'll cast a T14 head as far as I can throw it, maybe 80 feet or so. And I'll count to 30, 35, 40, and then start pulling, bam, bam, make 4 or 5 pulls, and then stop. Let it fall back. So it's going, and sometimes I'll even slip 3 or 4 feet of that retrieve line back. I call it the 15-minute retrieve, but it's amazing by doing that teasing in that deeper water and letting it fall back. Those fish could be following it up, and if you keep coming, I've had them come right to the surface, and sometimes I always let the fly, when I just about a foot from where my leader hits or attaches to the line, just about before the butt hits the rod tip, I stop the fly and I hover it. And sometimes I'll do a figure eight, like you do for pike and muskie.
Yep.
But I'll hover it because those fish coming out of deep water, they might be holding back. But the minute you hover it, and with a fly like a whistler that will do the dip and diving, it starts to fall again. And that's another reason why I love flash tails, because no matter what with that flash tail, when that fly's going down, that flash tail is wagging at them. It's just moving. And boom, they'll hit it.
I've employed that technique a lot of times, Dan, and I even have another technique that I've actually hooked up a tuna with. So depending on which way the current's going and the wind direction and how your boat's drifting, if it's set up right, you could just dump all your line out and just let it sink. And by the time it tightens up, then you start stripping. So I've done that in that situation quite a bit.
It works.
Let
It works.
sink.
And unless you're, dyed in the wool, so-called quote-unquote purist, slipping line back, dropping your line just back and forth like it, putting it all out. It's the way that the fish. And we used to do the same thing fishing for tarpon on the Rio Colorado in Casamar in Costa Rica. We'd be in the river. The boats, we anchor up in about 9-10 feet of water, cast out to deep water, let the fly, fishing lead core line back in those days. Lead core line with a running line. Let that lead core line come around, fishing big whistler styles, because we needed flies that pushed water. Come around behind the boat, straight downstream. If we didn't get bit on the swing, straight downstream, 8-9 feet of water in the river current. Strip, slip back. Strip 3 feet, slip back a foot. Strip, slip back again. Sometimes we get halfway back, we dump 10 feet. And I called it the 15-minute retrieve. And you'd be surprised. A tarpon with a mouth, got a mouth this big, when you would drop back or you would just have the fly, you'd feel just a little tick, like a stick hit your fly. You better set, because they just swim up behind and go, and I think what you feel is when the fly hits the back of their throat, and set the hook. But that kind of retrieve, working it slow, takes patience. If you're an impatient sort of person that's got to constantly cast, you're not going to catch too many fish in that situation. And in blue water, doing like you talked about, offshore for tuna and other things, you got to do the same thing. You got to get it down. You got to play in their face. You got to bring it up, feed it back. Make it act like an injured bait fish, dropping and falling, and that's where the flash tails. I don't tie anything without a flash tail. Even my trout flies have got flash tails in them. I tie, fly this small for white bass with a flash tail. That's on a size 2 hook. So,
Yeah. It's funny that you say that, how the retrieval works in the deep water and things like that, because the muskie guys and pike guys, when they fish in the summertime and the fish, take into the deeper part of the lake or the river, that's exactly what they're doing. They're feeding that. I mean, they're letting it sink for 10 minutes, and then they start retrieving it, and they do it, and then they feed it back, because they want to agitate that fish that's hanging out at the bottom. Now you're talking lake versus ocean, but
same thing.
Same technique, which is it's crazy.
Yeah, the predator fish act the same. Now they may react differently to migratory bait or bait balling, but if they're ambushing fish like your pike is a good example. Now I fished pike. I fished a few times in water 15 to 20 feet deep, but all the pike, and I've caught a lot of them. I used to go up to Scott Lake Lodge in northern Saskatchewan, but I always went the first week after ice out. So all the pike were in bays that were 1.5 feet deep, because they spawned the first foot of ice-free bank, they'd spawn, and then the minute they could go to a shallow bay, that's where the water warmed up first. So we'd sight fish. It was wonderful. You cast, you could see those pike coming after your fly, and you tease them. But later, you got to do exactly what you were doing. They were deeper, and that worked. So
I think you guys did it. I think you guys did a trip up there. It was wasn't Bob Popovics involved with that one time?
Yeah, he was. Yeah.
I remember him telling me that.
Yeah.
So
And it
Joe,
was fun.
since you have him on that, why don't you
Yeah.
just ask your typical question that you ask
So
everybody?
I ask everybody the same question, Dan, and sometimes it's not so obvious, but what's you would think that it's obvious. Like I asked Bob Popovics the same thing, and I asked a lot of people. But so what's your favorite fish to catch on a fly?
Oh gosh.
I mean, one that like says, "Oh my God, I gotta go back and do that again." That was just awesome.
Yeah. God, what would it be? I guess my favorite fish on a fly is still a tarpon.
Okay, yeah, that's mine
Still a
too.
tarpon.
Yeah,
Still a tarpon. And, you look at all the things about a tarpon. You could catch them in current. You could catch them in rivers. You could catch them in, uh, flats. You got them sight fishing. Sight fishing is a challenge. I mean, you put me on a river with Jake Jordan. A tidal flow underneath the bridge at 7 Mile with Jake Jordan at night, hanging a fly in the current. I'll do that. But once you hook a tarpon, I don't care if it's retrieving a fly, soaking a fly, sight casting for them, blind casting for them. Once you hook them, they're going to be a tarpon. They're
it's
going to
ape
come
shit.
out of that. Yeah, it just goes.
All hell
Everything
breaks
goes.
loose.
Everything goes crazy.
Yeah.
And you had better do your job. You better bow when that fish jumps every time. If you don't, he's going to throw that hook, especially if you're fishing barbless. And you better you better be able to put the pressure on. You've got to know how to play the angles. You've got to have the right reel, the right drag. Now, yeah, back in the old days, yeah, we landed a few fish with knuckle busters without a good drag. But I take a good reel. I remember, I fact it's up on my bookcase right there, when I got the first anti-reverse Seamaster, and that's the first thing he was putting out. And I can't tell you how many tarpon I've caught on that. And once you learn how to use the anti-reverse for big game, you can beat them just as fast. You just play a tighter drag, and you you finger the spool, and but you don't get your knuckles busted either. Tarpon. I think and baby tarpon are fun. You go to Rio Chico, Venezuela. You go to the back country where you're catching 2 to 6 pounders, occasionally a bigger one. Fishing a 8 weight, or I don't like to fish too much lighter because you never know. And God, I mean, Rio Chico, Venezuela was known for the baby tarpon fishery with occasional junior, what I call the junior tarpon, 25, 30 pounds. But we would go along those mangroves, throwing little poppers and smaller versions of tarpon flies. The tropical punch, that was one of my favorite. This fly here, I showed it earlier, but this fly here in the mangrove areas, fishing that orange and yellow, that little fly, I can't even tell you how many baby tarpon on that. But baby tarpon are fun.
Yep.
They're not ball busters either. So
Right.
they jump, get off, you're back for another. But the grab is great. So
So now that we're
Yeah.
talking about flies, if you could
Yeah.
fish one fly and that's it,
I already
for
know the
any,
answer to this.
any piece of water, what would the fly be?
you'd be my whistler.
Exactly
It'd
what
be-
I
it-
would
now-
have thought.
Excuse me, my allergies out here. I could make the whistler huge like this for black bass. I can't tell you how many largemouth. Now, if I was going to go down to Mexico and fish those black bass if I wasn't fishing a popper, I'd be throwing whistlers this big for those big bass down in Mexico. And you can fish little ones, little small whistlers, but you tie them full, you tie them different colors. Look how many guys fish largemouth bass, and all they fish is a bucktail leadhead jig.
Yeah.
And that thing goes like this. They drop, let it fall. Well, the whistler doesn't fall quite as fast, but it does fall great, and you can really control it. So if I'm looking at the attributes of the action, not just because it's my fly, but it's because of what it does. Is why I would. I think I could stick with the whistler fresh in salt water and hold my own. I've even caught brown trout on whistlers, big brown trout. They feed on bullheads. Tie one in brown. I'd go on trout in a river with big brown trout and throw that, I'd catch one. You know, because that looks like a bullhead to them. And so, yeah, that's what I'd use.
Okay.
If I only had one. If I only had one. But I tell you what, I'm not. One fly's not enough. I mean, I've got to have, I got to have the Clouser style like this, in different sizes, and the long. Now my answer to lefty deceiver was my Sarmal Mac, which is this one, but got to have different ones just in case the bait fish. But I could hold my own pretty much with a Whistler anywhere. Might get my butt kicked sometimes, but I wouldn't fish just one fly.
It's just
Jesus, George, we were pike fishing the other day. How many times did we change flies? Like every 10, 15 minutes.
And what fly did you end up going back to every time?
I went back to a natural bulkhead deceiver that George tied, and I caught my biggest pike on it.
Yeah, pike love deceivers. My favorite was red and yellow, and then they love the ones I fished for northern Saskatchewan out of Scott Lake Lodge and all those places. They love a red and yellow whistler, fly-tail whistler.
Yeah.
But a deceiver, to me, and for pike, either orange collar, yellowtail, or red collar, yellowtail. And in fact, I've got a wonderful picture of Lefty Cray. He and I were fishing out of Scott Lake Lodge for pike, and he's holding up his, I believe it was a yellow and red deceiver.
I think I had that picture. I think it was his birthday, and I posted that picture on Facebook. And I think you hit me up. You're like, I took that picture.
Yeah, that was my picture.
I remember
I took
that.
picture. Yeah. And I still got it. And I look at that picture when I go through. We're doing stuff like this, pulling flies, doing fly conversations, and I've got several shots of Lefty that I took over the years, and whenever that comes up, Lefty and I were very close. He was close to a lot of people. I mean, but we were very close. And he came out to California to fish with me in the early '70s. Yeah, because he was writing his first book on saltwater fly fishing. He wanted to come out here and fish with me because he heard through the grapevine or whatever, maybe Bobby Popovic, somebody told him that, Blanton was the guy that helped one of the pioneers in fly fishing. Russ Chatham was probably one of the first to catch, I'm sure he was the first to catch a striper on a fly in the ocean and in San Francisco Bay. But I was one of the early ones, and Lefty came out, but after that we were really close friends, and we talked at least once or twice a week, and he was a really good mentor, helped me a lot with my outdoor riding and things. So when I look at those pictures, this is the point I'm making, I get pretty nostalgic, and I get, miss him a lot. He's, as so many people do, but he contributed so much to this saltwater fly fishing, the whole gamut. He wasn't alone for sure, but that he was probably the most well known.
Yeah, and for anybody that wants to check him out, I mean, there's tons of YouTube videos on his casting clinics and all kinds of stuff. It's just awesome. I actually took a casting clinic with him in Maryland back in the 90s. But yeah, his videos and sometimes some of his interviews are awesome to watch.
I got to tell you a little story about Lefty. He was we're out in the bay with me. It's in my 18-foot Mariner center console, and he's up in the bow. And Lefty's style of casting was he'd make his back cast, but he always let the back cast drift real low, and then he'd come through with that little snap, and a lot of times that line would come in shoulder height, but it'd be off his shoulder. And I always learned, because I had to cast through the boat all the time. I never let anybody I didn't trust cast through the boat with me standing in the line of fire. So I could cast through the boat all day long and not hit anything. But I held my elbow higher, held my back cast up a little more, and I did all that casting with my elbow a little higher, which everybody says don't do, but that's what I had to do. And I taught casting for years too. But I'd come through like that. And he'd say, Danny, you got to, you really need to drop that elbow down, and you come like that. And I looked at him. I said, okay, Lefty, come back here and show me how you do that. Lefty was quick. He got it. He says, you asshole. I said, well, come back here and do it. See if you can get through this center console without breaking it, this windshield.
Yeah.
And he just turned around. He says, "Keep going. You're doing fine." So you had to adjust. So there's more ways to cast. It's just a
Yeah.
matter of timing. It's just a matter of timing. Sidearm casting, overhead casting. But when you have to clear something, you got to get that line up, and you got to keep it up when you come through, and yet
Right.
still let your rod load. So it's one thing to let it drop almost to the water. Lefty, I mean, I swear to God, on his back cast, that fly cleared the water by an inch. Then he'd come forward his cast would always go from low in the back up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We actually have a question, but I think we answered this. It was Johnny was asking how old were you, and I think we clarified you were going to be turning 80. And the other one is, how old were you when you started fly fishing? I believe it was 15. That's when you first started fly fishing?
15. And again, I watched guys cast the Golden Gate casting ponds in different places. But so I was interested in it. I wanted to be a fly fisherman. But I didn't start out with a floating line and the traditional stuff. Russ Chatham and Hugh Chatham and all the guys, they were fishing salmon, king salmon in the rivers. And they were stealing. They weren't using floating lines. They were using sinking shooting heads. The shooting head was invented on the West Coast.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so they were using shooting heads. At the time, there was only one that was commercially made, a fast sinking line. It's like about a Type 2. We started having the line manufacturers like Sunset Line and Twine and Scientific Anglers. They started adding on different sink rates, densities, as we needed them. They were good. They worked with us. But lead core, Gladding Mark V lead core, coated. It was a plastic coated lead core trolling line, 20-pound test. We would take and cut lengths of that from 10 feet long to 30 feet long, and we'd put a loop on each end and have it. If we were using a mono shooting line, we'd just use a 3-turn clinch knot with mono, or if we're using a coated line, we'd put a loop on it, and that was our shooting head. And so then they finally started making Type 3, Type 4, Type 5, Type 6, it's faster sinking lines. So today I just use the standard fast one, I forget what it's called now, but I use the one that's made, I don't use lead core line anymore. You don't need it. But I still fish that fast sinking line.
And now it's all tungsten powder mixed into the formulas.
Right, yeah, the tungsten powder lines, yeah. And that's how they started making all of them. Like the first fast sinking, the Type 1, that's how they did it. They mixed tungsten powder with it. So they just, if they needed more tungsten powder, they'd have to make the line a little thicker,
right,
a little bigger diameter. And then Sunset Line and Twine did it a little differently. They used a lead core. They put a taper around the lead core. And it was a pretty good line. And then we used, like I say, the times when we could get by with it, just a straight length of level LC13 lead core line.
Yeah, a Cortland lined.
Yeah, it worked good. Yeah. Today we don't need it to use the tungsten lines, but we have lines today that literally let us fish for just about anything, anywhere.
Yep.
And that was because the industry, as more and more people did it, and it took people, writers, Lefty Craze, and Stu Apps, and you name it, all the guys, myself, I'll include myself in that, promoting the different kinds of fly fishing, especially in saltwater, whether it was blue water or bay fishing or river fishing or deep water lake fishing, encouraging more people to participate in that, which produced a demand for those lines. They weren't going to produce those lines until there was somebody going to buy them.
Right.
And so once we got enough people interested, they started making a few. Then they'd send a few out to different notable anglers, and they'd use them and go, "Hey, this works great." And then we'd start putting the word out, especially those of us that belong to big clubs. Like I belong to the largest fly fishing club in the San Francisco Bay Area, maybe in California. And it was the most diverse club. because of guys like me and others, that instead of being a trout club, it became black bass, saltwater, stripers, the tuna, you name it.
Yeah.
And we'd go on trips. My club here in San Jose, which is the San Francisco Bay Area, we'd hire a Greyhound bus, throw some 8-foot prams in the belly, and charter that bus for a weekend, leave on a Friday night, drive all the way to Redondo Beach, Southern California, and the guys that didn't have the prams would rent these wooden rental boats at King Harbor, and we'd go in the harbor, and they had a hot water discharge from the power plant that attracted anchovies, and the Pacific bonita would come in there by the ton. And we'd catch Pacific bonita that would go from 2 pounds to 6 pounds on fly, and some of the guys in my club had never seen their backing before, and all of a sudden they're just holding on, and we got these boats that are kind of anchored around this blowhole, and these guys fish are running around anchor ropes, and they're having to chase them, but they were having a hell of a time, and they got a good lesson on how to handle their reels by catching a fish like a bonita that would just rip. A 3-pounder would take 100 yards, on a light, not a real light drag, but a fairly good drag. It would go.
I've caught a few Atlantic bonita myself, and not to get it mixed up with the false albacore, which is they're two different types of fish.
Yeah. The false albacore, Atlantic bonita, and then our Pacific bonita.
Right.
And we have albacore. We have the true albacore, and then we have bonita, and we have black skipjack, oceanic black skipjack,
What's that fish that I've been hearing about? They've been catching off the coast. I think it's the albies, off the coast of Oregon, right?
Yeah, they'll migrate all the way up there
Yeah.
this time of year. Then they'll come back. They have the migration up and down the coast, but when we mostly fished for them during the summer and fall, they were, usually south of the Golden Gate. They're usually down in Southern California area in Mexico. Then in Mexico, I used to take 2 weeks every year and lead groups to Laredo, Baja, Mexico. Sometimes I go down and stay a month. And I had the same guide for 17 or 18 years down there. And we'd go out to the islands and, again, using the same techniques we've been talking about. And we'd catch a dorado. We'd catch dorado on top with big pop, mahi, dorado, whatever you want to call them. And we'd catch those beautiful big dorado on top with poppers and catch them with streamers too. But then we'd go down and catch oceanic black skipjack, which were kind of like false albacore.
Yep.
They were bigger than and more football than the Pacific bonita, and geez, they would pull.
Yeah, I've caught some skipjack.
Yeah, they really went, and occasionally we'd get amberjack and Pacific yellowtail. Now Pacific yellowtail would really go. Now they'd get up 25, 30 pounds, and they're just a basic jack, but we'd always take a big scoop of live bait in the live bait well in the Poungas. So we'd get out to an area and my guide, I really trained him how to chum. Some of the guys come out there and take a whole scoop of net and dump a whole net full of bait over. And the fish would run on and then eat all the bait and be gone. I said, no, don't do that. Throw 4, 5, 6 at a time. Boom, boom, boom. Tease them. And then throw a few more. And then you can keep them coming by just tossing 1 or 2. And we could get on fish like that. And they'd be dolphin fish, dorado, and skippies. We'd be on them all day. Just as long as you did. When you ran out of bait, you went home. You went back to the lodge. Yeah.
Sure. Yep. I've experienced that myself.
Yeah.
Joe, any questions? I want to start wrapping it up because we're reaching an hour and a half. I know we all could have questions, but I want to kind of do the after show as well.
I told you I yak a lot.
That's all right. There's nothing wrong with that.
Honestly, I have all my questions answered. I mean, we could talk for another hour. But yeah, everything I wanted to know, I think I got through for sure.
We might have to do a round 2 in like a year.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you guys thinking of me, and it's always fun to do something like this.
Well, like I said, I mean, when growing up and on one hand, you can count the guys who were influential, right? I mean, you're one of them, Lefty, Bob Clouser. From what I see, I mean, I didn't grow up with Joe Brooks and those guys, so from guys who now are my age in the 50s, it was you, it was Lefty, it was a couple guys, so
Hmm.
for sure, Flip Powell as well, it was a
Hmm.
pleasure to have you on.
Yeah. Okay. Well, you know, again, it was a pleasure to be on, and thank you for thinking of me. Anytime I can be of help to you guys, you just yell.
We'll definitely be reaching out a lot. I want to say, everybody, thank you at the audience for watching, stopping in. If you are going to be watching it later on, make sure you check out that promo code ATV10 to get your 10% off on Midwest Bucktails. Dan, thank you so much. I can't say thank you enough for what you've done for the industry and for your stripers out west on the West Coast. A lot of the people out on the West that I follow and that follow me. Um, they always talk about what you've done and what you do in the conservation for the striped bass on the West Coast. So thank you so much for that.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
You got it.
All right, man. Take care now.
All right, thank you guys.
Yeah.
Yep. You can hang on, Dan, if you want for a sec.